Okay, everybody. As I promised, I'm going to try to do a little bit of review today in anticipation of the test on Friday. So where I'm at in the book, if you have your book, look at page 41. There's a section called Key Terms. There's a number of terms here that the author has listed in alphabetical order. So that's not necessarily in the order of the chapter, but in alphabetical order. So I'm going to go through the list, and I've put check marks by the things that I know for sure you should look up and be aware of in preparation for the test. So in the first column, the first word, adolescence, I would pay attention to in your PowerPoint. You're going to see that this author believes that adolescence begins sometime between the ages of 10 and 13 years of age. The second term I've also checked off is adolescent generalization gap. This comes under a heading called stereotyping, and it's very specific to adolescence based on a limited group of information about a very small group of adolescents. The third word, biological process. Expect questions about biological, cognitive, and social processes. So, for instance, a biological process would be a doctor who assumes that the kid's problem is due to some sort of chemical imbalance, for instance. That would be biological. Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory. That's just based on context. So just understand if you see ecological connected to Bronfenbrenner's theory. Case study, an in-depth look at an individual used in unique situations. Cognitive process. This would be something to do with the person's thinking being maladaptive, their thinking being irrational and creating problems for them. Context, the setting in which development occurs. I'm just going down the list here and checking off things that I'm pretty sure I've got test questions for to help you. Correlation coefficient. It's one of the three major types of research that I told you to be aware of. So a correlation coefficient is going to deal with a number somewhere between 0 and a 1.0. So the larger the number, the stronger the relationship between variables. Correlational research is the degree of the variables, the degree of relationship between the variables measured by the coefficient. It allows you to predict outcomes. Cross-sectional research is towards the end of the chapter, and that's going to deal with time span research. Cross-sectional is when they use different people, but all at the same time. So you might have 5 different groups in 5 different rooms, but you do it all on the same day, and you give them some sort of testing or some sort of thing like that. Dependent variable, that's going to come under experimental research, and the dependent variable is what we call the effect or the result. So if you were to take an appetite suppressant and you lost weight, the losing of the weight would be the dependent variable. That's the first column. Second column, first word, descriptive research. The descriptive research is going to be anything to do with gather information and report information. Early, late experience issue. I expect a question on that. Early experienced people believe that what happens to you early in life will affect you for the rest of your life. And late experienced people say, well, we believe that what happens to you early in life will affect you, but late experience can overcome early experience. Eclectic theoretical orientation. This would be towards the end of after all the different theories are covered, and eclectic just simply means you select from those theories the things that you like, and you just discard those things you're not in agreement with. Emerging adults, simply put, a transition from adolescence to adulthood. You're not an adolescent anymore, but you're not socially, not legally, but socially an adult yet. Erikson's theory, 1 or 2 questions. Psychosocial theory, where you deal with a crisis over an 8 different periods of development or stages. Experience sampling, also a type of descriptive research. Experience sampling, if you see the word beeper or pager, where you are randomly paged and then you respond to some questions. Experimental research will be towards the end of the chapter. Experimental research, make sure you understand what random assignment is, what the experimental group is, what the control group is, and the independent and dependent variables. So that's all about 2 or 3 paragraphs, but any part of what I just said will fall under experimental research. And you can determine cause and effect. Third column, I just told you about the independent variable. The independent variable is what we believe is going to cause something to happen. Information processing theory, simply put, the analogy is that of a computer. You input information, you store information, and then you retrieve information at some particular processing speed. Late adolescence would be a time of identity exploration. After young people go through puberty, they turn their attention to their future, what they're going to do with their lives, and so on. Longitudinal research would be the same people over time. So you might follow the same group of people year after year and ask them the same survey or interviews. Fourth column, naturalistic observation would be a form of descriptive research in which you go to where the people are and you observe them. You remain unobtrusive. They don't know that they're being observed. So an example might be a graduate assistant pretending to take the test in the classroom with the other students when in reality they are just monitoring the other students for their behavior as to whether they're cheating on tests or not. The students do not know that that person is monitoring them. Nature, nurture, expect 1 or 2 questions here. Nature would be biology, nurture would be life's experiences. Piaget's theories, certainly expect something from Piaget's theory, 4 stages. It's a cognitive theory, and so pay attention to his stages. Psychoanalytic theory, understand that at this point it's enough to know that psychoanalytic theorists use a lot of subconscious thought. They believe in symbolism and they believe in emotional tendencies. They like to get into your emotions and so on. Social cognitive theory, that would be Albert Bandura's theory. Some people call it social learning theory. It's observational learning. You watch what the other person does, a role model, and then you try to mimic that behavior. Socio-emotional processes. When you see the word processes, expect on the test biological, cognitive, and social processes. So a socio-emotional process would be an example of the neighborhood in which a kid is growing up, or relationships or things that have happened to them in life that affects them. Standardized testing, I'm sure there's probably a question about that, in which you can compare an individual score to all other people who have ever taken a certain test. It is also part of descriptive research. Stereotype, pay attention to the difference between a stereotype and an adolescent generalization gap. A stereotype would just be a general statement about people or groups of people, could be about their ethnicity, could be about their socioeconomic status, and so on. Whereas adolescent generalization gap is going to be specific just to teenagers. Theory, I would know the definition of a theory, an interrelated coherent set of ideas that help explain and predict behavior. And then finally, the last word in the fourth column is Vygotsky's theory. It's a cognitive theory in which he believes that you operate in a cognitive environment. I would know that the cognitive environment is made up of three things. It's a social interaction with a skilled individual, someone who has information that they can help you to advance your development cognitively. It's the culture in which you find yourself and the technology available to you. Those three things make up your cognitive environment. Under key people, I'm looking at the first column, Joseph Adelson. When you see Joseph Adelson, you should think of adolescent generalization gap. Joseph Adelson came up with that concept that he believes we tend to stereotype young people based on a very limited group of young people who get all the attention. And so it's a limited amount of information about a limited group of people. Same column, Albert Bandura, again, social cognitive theory. He believes that you can learn through observation and then mimicking what you see. So if a little boy sees his dad help an elderly person, a few days later the little boy sees an elderly person and he goes and assists them, that would be Bandura's theory of observational learning. Bronfenbrenner, that's an ecological theory. It's based on a social context. Second column, Erik Erikson, a psychosocial theory. So he really looks at the development of people through social stages, with the fifth stage being the most important, and that is the stage of adolescence, identity versus identity confusion or role confusion. Sigmund Freud, I think I suggested that you know about his theory in general, know that he uses defense mechanisms and how they operate, know that he has a theory of 5 psychosexual stages of development. He came up with the concept of personality development with the id, the ego, and the superego. In the third column, Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead's work was sociocultural. She studied the people of Samoa and believed that kids do not go through storm and stress. Piaget, a cognitive theorist, again, 4 stages of cognitive development. He believes we're trying to understand our world, and in the process we organize information, and once we get it organized, we sometimes have to adapt or to change or reorganize information. We'll cover more about that in chapter 3. And then finally, in the 4th column, B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is going to fall under the category of behaviorism, and he believed in operant conditioning, and your participant would do what you want, and then you would follow that with a reinforcer, and if they don't do what you want, you follow it with a punisher in an effort to shape their behavior in the direction you want it to go. He believed that there always has to be a consequence, and the consequences are the reinforcers and punishers, and always follow the behavior. With behaviorism, by the way, it has to be observable and measurable. So they must be able to see the behavior and then document frequency. And then finally, the last person listed under key people is Vygotsky stuff. And again, I talked about it in the section above. And Vygotsky came up with the social cognitive, cognitive environment. And he believes, and it's a cognitive theory, but he believes that your cognitive development is affected by the people you surround yourself that can help you to advance. Okay, I've got a couple of minutes. I'm going to try to do my best to look at the chapter. So again, if you have your book, I'm back on page 3, Historical Perspective. Under early history, expect a couple of questions on the Greek philosophers, Aristotle and Plato. Know the difference. Towards the bottom of the page is G. Stanley Hall, and he believed in the storm and stress of youth, and that it was brought on by puberty, which is a biological process. Page 4, Margaret Mead, sociocultural. Just kind of try to follow me in the book. I'm on page 6, stereotyping. Know the difference. A stereotype is a generalization. It reflects our impressions and beliefs about a particular group of people. That's a pretty broad statement. But if you go to the next paragraph, then you see adolescent generalization gap. And that's more specific about teenagers in particular. I'm on page 9, social context. About 2 or 3 sentences down, the setting in which development occurs. So be sure you understand that. The global perspective on page 12. I suggested to you before, and I'm going to remind you again, look on page 13, the paragraph on family. It gives you some of the secular trends around the world that's going on under a global perspective. For instance, if the divorce rate increased in the United States, did it follow the same pattern around the world in which it did? Did we move from larger families to smaller families? We did. Did other countries around the world follow that same trend? Yes. So read the paragraph and you'll see the various trends. On page 14, the biological, cognitive, and social. Make sure you can distinguish between the three and expect an example, and you'll say that's a biological process, or someone is daydreaming and that's a cognitive process. I would know the difference between early and late adolescence on page 15. Early adolescence is going to be preoccupation with their bodies because of puberty. Late adolescence is going to be focused on their values, their future, and things they want to do with their life. On page 17, I'm trying to move quickly here, page 17, emerging adults are young people who are still dependent on their parents, even though they may legally be adults, they still receive assistance of some sort. On page 22, nature, nurture, expect a question from that section. Know the difference between nature and nurture. Nature's biology, nurture is your life experiences. Early and late experience, I think I selected a question from that. Early experience would be the things that happened to you early in life that set you up for the rest of your life. Late experience, people believe you can change those things by later experiences. On page 25, know the scientific method. There's 4 steps to it. Pay attention to the order of those steps. Also, just below that, definition of the word theory. Interrelated, coherent set of ideas that helps explain phenomena and make predictions. And then about the middle of the page, psychoanalytic theory, there's a few sentences there I would read. What do psychoanalytic theorists believe or primarily focus on? Unconscious thought, emotions, and symbolism. Then it goes into a discussion of Freud's work, probably 2 or 3 or 4 questions on Freud stuff. His stages of psychosexual development, what he bases his theory on, defense mechanisms, the id, the ego, and the superego. At the bottom of that page, Erikson's theory, psychosocial theory. And for right now, that looks like, well, I would also pay attention specifically to stage 5, which is about what our subject matter is about. 27, Piaget's theory, and I've kind of covered this already. It's a cognitive theory, and he talks about organizing and adapting information as we try to learn. On page 28, Vygotsky, I've covered that for you already, and below that, information processing, inputting, storage, and retrieving information. At the bottom of that page onto the next page is Bandura stuff and Skinner stuff. So with B.F. Skinner, it's operant conditioning requiring consequence. With Bandura, it's social cognitive theory. It's a behavior theory, but it takes into account your cognitive abilities as you learn. At the bottom of 29, an ecological theory, that's Bronfenbrenner's theory. If you know that much, you'll be just fine for right now. 30, middle of the page, eclectic theoretical orientation. Hopefully you're following me and putting check marks, because I'm pretty much looking at the test and looking at the text. Anyway, that's when you use different parts of different theories that you like and you discard those things you don't need. Beginning on page 31, methods of collecting data. Everything on these next couple of pages are called descriptive research. Go through these, make sure you understand the differences between them of a naturalistic or control setting in a laboratory, surveys, interviews, standardized testing, experience sampling, case studies, and all of those together include what we call descriptive research. On the bottom of page 33 is correlational research. You're looking at the degree of relationship between variables. Understand what a correlation coefficient is. It's a number that indicates the strength of the relationship, and as the number goes up, the strength of the correlation increases. And then finally, at the middle of the page, on page 34, experimental research. I see some words bold printed: independent variables, dependent variables, random assignment. Know each one of those terms and how they fit into an experiment and what they do. And finally, the last part of the test is covered on page 35, time span research. You will be okay as long as you study cross-sectional and longitudinal. Know the difference between the two. And that's where I'm stopping in the chapter, nothing further than that. An email was sent out modifying the terms at which you could take your test. The window will be open for a 24-hour period, but the test, once you start, you have 1 hour to complete the test. You won't be able to back up and change your mind. So once you click on an answer, make sure you're satisfied with that answer, because when you move on, it's done. So that's it for now. We'll see how things go, and hopefully you will get a good feel for how the course is going to go. Thanks.